The conversation this afternoon, at least the beginning of it, needs to be quite a bit more serious. The reason for that is that we're all well aware of the fact that the world is not in perfect shape. We, of course, know that in the last 2 years, the financial crisis brought the whole economic system very close to collapse. And we're not necessarily sure that that couldn't happen again and that that moment couldn't be quite soon. We also know that there's a poverty crisis with many definitions of it. The most striking one is, of course, that 2/3 of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. Over 1 billion people don't have access to clean water, and I could continue the list of the statistics. We have a health crisis with a devastating array of indicators. The one that strikes me because of a couple of the projects I'm working on right now is that malaria alone, which is a preventable disease, claims a child's life every 30 seconds who wouldn't need to die, meaning that over 200 children will die just in the time that we're having this conversation. The vast majority of them being in Africa, but in some other parts of the world also. We have an education crisis with nearly 1 billion people entering the 21st century illiterate. And I know it's completely shocking to the Academy of Management, but the definition of illiterate means that even if we publish it in an A-level journal, they can't read it. We have a peace crisis with, depending on who's doing the defining and who's doing the counting, we currently have 37 active wars and conflagrations going on the planet. And the big one is the environmental crisis, with the main one that's caught the media's attention, of course, being BP and its relationship to the Gulf. But also, if you look at China, which of course has been on a spectacular economic juggernaut, the leaders in China know absolutely that the only thing that can stop China is the environmental crisis, the series of environmental crises that they're facing. China by its own estimates, that 650,000 people die prematurely each year because of environmental issues. If we pretended we were back in another era, and we could say that, well, that's a horrendous problem for China, but we're not in China. Well, let's look again. If you look at the city of Los Angeles, the current estimates are that 85% of the air pollution in LA originates in some form in China. So we can pretend that it's their problem, but in fact, there is no such thing anymore as their problem. We all use the vocabulary of being a globally integrated planet, but very few times do we slow down to really realize that that influences our every waking moment, every bit of what we define as life, every bit of what we define as community, every bit of what we define as civilization. I'm going to stop with my list of problems because otherwise I'll have all of you completely depressed, which is not my purpose. But it's absolutely clear that we won't be able to solve any of those problems using the approaches and perspectives that we've used previously. And that's where the creative economy, or what does it mean if we begin bringing an artistic lens, an artistic perspective to the whole array of skills that we already have, becomes important. The bottom line is we're up against crises we cannot continue to live with, and we know that prior approaches to solutions won't work. This talk is entitled The Creative Economy and Beyond. So what is a creative economy? My current definition is a creative economy, extreme creativity combining with huge market potential to solve problems worth solving, solutions worthy of our humanity. That's what a creative economy is. All of us are humbled by the enormity of the challenges facing the 21st century, and we're equally aware that the dehydrated language and concepts of the 20th century just won't work anymore. Worse yet, as we consider the role of the private sector, we're all aware of the extent to which the private sector has dominant influence in the world right now. Klaus Schwab, president of the World Economic Forum, has stated that in today's trust-starved climate, our market-driven system is under attack. Large parts of the population feel that business has become detached from society, that business interests are no longer aligned with societal interests. The only way to respond to this new wave of anti-business sentiment is for business to take the lead and to reposition itself clearly and convincingly as a part of society. What would that repositioning look like? What level of creativity would it take for business to reposition itself clearly and convincingly as a part of society? And if you listen, the fiery little back and forth going on about BP, you know that if that's the public conversation, that the repositioning has to take place even for us to hold the right conversation, let alone to make any changes. Albert Einstein gave us a structure for thinking about repositioning when he said you can never solve a problem on the level at which it was created. You must learn to see the world anew. One of the roles of artists is to see the world anew, to see the world in new ways, to express what they see about the world in new ways. Prior UN Secretary Kofi Annan, just when the UN Global Compact was being formed, and of course the UN Global Compact is the set of companies who've publicly committed to being a part of achieving the Millennium Goals. Kofi Annan challenged the world's business community to reposition itself by what I would label as jumping levels. Instead of focusing on the micro level, how can I succeed as an individual? How can my individual company succeed? From a country perspective, how can my individual country succeed? But to go to the macro level, how do we look at ourselves as a planet, as all of humanity, and what would that mean if we succeed? How do we take civilization as a whole to be our client? And he said, let us choose to unite the power of markets with the strengths of universal ideals. Let us choose to reconcile the creative forces of private enterprise with the needs of the disadvantaged and the requirements of future generations. So I and a number of other people started looking around for examples. One that intrigued me was the initial conversations in the industry that most of us are in, which is education, and our specific niche within that, which is business education. But the location is not here in Montreal, but in Russia. And Ruben Vardanian, who's one of the most successful businessmen in Russia, observed that given the dysfunction in Russian society, that there basically was no way that the economy could thrive, and therefore no way individual businesses could thrive. Remember, this is being spoken by a person who's one of the leading business people in Russia, unless they got a totally different quality of leadership for society and then therefore for the economy. He sat down with 3 of his business friends over dinner, and by the end of dinner, they had an extremely large pile of money on the table, and they decided to start a business school. And that business school, Sokolov, has since opened, Moscow School of Management, with its primary purpose to create the kind of leaders that society needed, and within that the economy needed, but in that order. the arts were a part of that whole discussion as they thought about how you shape a curriculum and how you shape a society. At about the same time, a Croatian executive I spoke with echoed exactly what I thought Vardanian was saying when he said that we won't survive another generation of leaders like those we've had in the past. How many of us, when we sit down and say, no, we're not going to do what we did with the last client, with the last course, say that we cannot continue to produce the kind of leaders we've been producing because society won't survive it. My fundamental question is, do we in this room believe that rising to Kofi Annan's and Klaus Schwab's challenge is possible? Do we believe in the possibility of a creative economy? Do we believe in our role in bringing it about? But what I'd like to do collectively is conceptually jump levels up to the macro level and ask 3 questions that are led by an artistic and a leadership appreciation. So leaders and artists, when they look at those big questions, great leaders and great artists, we have mediocre ones in both categories. I'm not talking about them. Okay, great leaders and great artists have 3 things in common. First is both great leaders and great artists have the courage to see reality the way it is. Not the way they want it to be, not the way somebody else is telling them it is, the way it actually is. Warren Buffett, when he said, and he said it a number of times, I'm not a businessman, I'm an artist. And they were like, why would Warren Buffett say that? He's a fabulous businessman. Yeah, but one of the skills that Warren Buffett, one of his many skills, is that he looks out at what's going on in society and the economy, and he absolutely decides for himself what it is that's going on out there. And it's interesting, it's a two-edged sword. The reality we tend not to see, both oftentimes, is denying the negative that's there, as well as not seeing the beauty that's there. And of course, the whole tradition that's now gotten picked up by the positive organization scholars and by the appreciative inquiry, whole set of wonderful folks, is if we can't see the beauty, the good that's there, how do we leverage it? If we don't see the extreme ugliness that's there, how can we eradicate it? Second, so the first one's the courage to see reality the way it is. The second one is the courage to see possibility even when nobody else can see a possibility, even when people label you as naive, as completely ridiculous. Don't you know what's really going on out there? Can you see possibility? Can you see the beauty and the possibility of beauty? Can you still imagine that we can have a world where nobody is hungry? Or have we reduced ourselves to a conversation that says less ugly is good enough? If we reduce the amount of malnutrition, it's good enough. If we reduce the amount of pollution, less ugly, it's good enough. Or can we actually imagine the beautiful? The third one is, do we have the courage to inspire people to move from current reality back to possibility? The thing that both great leaders and great artists have in common, great artists don't keep their work hidden. It gets out there and it starts a conversation. Great leaders start a conversation, move the organizations and people in a direction. The first one is seeing reality. Do we have the courage to see reality as it actually is? Are we capable of seeing the world through our own eyes? And I'd humbly say, if we wanted to be empiricists, we're doomed, okay? All of the data is against us. Think just for a moment about, Remember way back then? Enron. How come almost nobody publicly saw what was going on with Enron until it totally collapsed? How do we explain Bernie Madoff and his $50 billion Ponzi scheme with one little accountant in a back office sort of shuffling around papers, and almost nobody publicly noticed what was going on? How come, whether you do the regulators, the media, all of the people, how come there wasn't a bigger story until it collapsed? Okay, so you could say both of those are unique events. Enron, Madoff, gets boring. We've talked about that. Okay, what happened with the whole financial sector? We can line up the names of all those companies. How come until the whole thing started to topple, we didn't notice it was quite that shaky? And maybe even more importantly, what are we not noticing right now? Even if we just limit ourselves to the financial sector, what are we not noticing right now because we're colluding in not seeing reality the way it is? There's research actually on our ability to collectively see what's going on. And one of the first sets of studies that I looked at for personal reasons, not professional reasons, was I was trying to understand what was going on during World War II. And how could all of those people have let what went on go on? And one of the fascinating, but in a macabre sense, things that I learned is in interviews that they've done after World War II, the vast majority, huge numbers of people literally didn't notice their neighbors disappearing, literally didn't see the trains going away, literally didn't see the smokestacks. Now, you could say they're all lying to the interviewers, and I'm sure there were some people, I'm sure there are some people that were lying, but they all weren't lying, okay? Is because it was so, and again, we can give explanations, so horrendous, we couldn't imagine that we could do that, et cetera, that psychologically keeps us whole by not seeing reality. So are we capable of not seeing reality? Absolutely. Psychologists have proved it. In my mind, and it's hugely important for me right now, the question is not why we have bad leaders or why a particular leader said one thing or another, especially things that I don't like. My much graver concern is why are all of us going along? Do we see patterns? Do we see unique events? Do we see what we need to see going on? So I want to put in one other example, because all of us had the pleasure of having one of my favorite colleagues with us last night, Henry Mintzberg. And we're all meeting at the moment in Montreal, which happens to be in the province of Quebec. And I think probably everybody in this room knows that Quebec has a very wonderful relationship with the rest of Canada. We go through a ritual on a not completely regular basis where we decide we're going to secede from the rest of Canada, become a unique country. And the first time, I now have dual citizenship. The U.S. changed its laws so that you could get Canadian citizenship without me losing my American citizenship, so I'm now a dual citizen. The very first time I was able to vote was in one of those elections where Quebec was all revved up to separate. And by the way, much to my shock coming out of the U.S., 94% of all people, not all registered voters, but all people voted. I think the U.S. currently gets kind of a high of 50% of the registered voters, and there are only 50% of people registered to vote at a high, so it's kind of around 25%. Here was 94%. Henry got in the middle of, very publicly on CBC, on our main radio and TV station, and he asked people to be artists rather than to be their normal consumers of the public media. And he said, "My fellow Quebecois, I ask that you," and he literally said, "close your radio, close your TV, i.e. stop listening to what other people are saying, go to your window and look out and ask yourself, who do our children play with?" Of course, all the little French kids and English kids and everybody else in this city play with each other. Who do you invite into your home for dinner? Of course, everybody in the neighborhood's busy inviting everybody back and forth. Who do you, etc. Henry is very pro-Canada staying together, but he was asking people to vote based on their own data, to open their own eyes and not see what the media was telling us to see, because the media was telling us that we all hate each other, that we can't stand anybody who isn't from the same linguistic and cultural group as we are. We didn't separate, so Henry's side won. We can't attribute it all to management strategy and how really influential academics are, but I'm sure he had an influence. That vote was 51% to 49, just squeaking into 51%. We don't tear apart countries. Yes, it could have happened, and it came very close to happening. If I take the question of the convenience of reality avoiding assumptions, my favorite is the phrase, "it's too big to fail." We've heard a lot of that. That was kind of a leitmotif in the financial services whole debacle. The U.S., my home country, the country I grew up in, is not too big to fail. Neither the country nor the economy. No country is. The planet is not too big to fail, and our species, human beings, are not too big and not too important to fail. Luckily, there have been hugely important scholars thinking about how we emotionally respond to the kind of data we're facing in the world right now, except most of them did it at a micro level and very few have done it at the kind of macro level we're discussing. One of them that's been a huge influence on me is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And of course, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work was on death and dying and looking at the stages that individual people go through when they're given a prognosis that says that they have a very short time left to live. And what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said is that people predictably go through stages of first denial. They don't believe that they have whatever disease that will in fact kill them very shortly. They then get angry. How could it happen to me? They then bargain. So the bargaining phase often looks at if they're very religious, I promise I'll pray every night, I'll give to the church, but just let me live. Just let me live until my kids are married so I can be a parent and be with them. Just there's always a sense of bargaining. Then as it sinks in that it's actually true, no bargaining's going to change it or will probably not change it, is there's a profound, profound depression. And then in Kubler-Ross's stages, there's acceptance that this is the truth about where I'm at. I want to take that framework and lay it on top of the relationship we currently have with the big picture, our planet, our civilization. I'd like to suggest that I think a large part of the public conversation is stuck at stage one, is in denial, for a lot of the reasons I've just said. But even when you think about, Krugman has this great description of the economy of extraordinary delusion. You know, that's Kubler-Ross's denial, extraordinary delusion. It's a great phrase. If you look at Al Gore's film that went on to win, you know, all sorts of awards, An Inconvenient Truth. That's the same issue. What was the dynamic? I have to sneak a little of the arts back in here. What had Al Gore done? I mean, he had a fairly good platform. He was a really well-known politician, right? He gave over 1,000 speeches. Absolutely nothing happened. He then paired up with a filmmaker. What are filmmakers? They're artists. And all of a sudden, that same speech transformed into an art form, caught the imagination of the world. Some people agreed with it, some people didn't agree with it, but guess what? The conversation was out of the box. He was pushing against denial. He could not do that with facts. He couldn't do it with the best speeches, and he couldn't do it even with his level of prominence. And he, of course, went on to win a Nobel Peace Prize and an Academy Award. I think it'd be really nifty to win an Academy Award, but whatever. Stage 2. Stage 1 is denial. Stage 2 is anger. Anger at the collective level is, how the hell did we get ourselves into this mess? Why aren't governments taking this more seriously? It's always the sense that we had a choice and we're blowing it. So it's not the victim sense. It's the sense standing in North America and knowing that we're extremely privileged in terms of access to resources, access to ways of well-being, and saying, but how could we have poverty? That's a choice. That's not predestined. Stage 3. Okay. Denial, anger, bargaining. My favorite example, again, on the world stage of bargaining, is the Kyoto Accords. Everybody got all revved up about which countries signed the Kyoto Accords, which countries didn't sign the Kyoto Accords. What basically is the structure of the Kyoto Accords? Structure of the Kyoto Accords are, we are going to reduce X pollutant by Y% by Z date. The entire structure is entirely how to be less bad. It has absolutely nothing to do with being good. It has nothing to do with the beautiful. It only has to do with being less ugly. The person that caught my attention in the environmental domain around not buying into that vocabulary, not thinking that less bad will in fact solve our problems, was William McDonough. Now, who's William McDonough? Is he, some kind of a scientist or something? Is he a member of the Academy of Management? No. Okay. He's an architect. Another form of artist. And he's the one who first came out and said that less bad is not good. Less ugly is not beautiful. I think it's quite interesting that one of the strongest voices on the environment happens to be an artist, not an environmental scientist. He's now one of the chief environmental consultants to the government of China. Interesting. Bargaining. 4th stage is depression. 4th stage is when you begin to get suspicious that even if we started doing everything right, it's too late, that we would have needed to wake up earlier, that in fact we can't get out of this, and worse yet, that my worst fears about how bad it is are actually true. And again, I probably along with a lot of other people, watched this whole little scenario with BP. Oh, they're just a few thousand gallons coming out. Oh, well, maybe they're 20,000 gallons coming out. Oh, well, maybe we missed with that. But that whole sense of it may be way worse than we thought it is, and it may be too late to turn it around. Where in the conversation, that's back the prior stage, where in the conversation about the Gulf did you last hear on BBC or CNN or Al Jazeera, I don't care, or CBC, our top news source here, where did you hear people talking about what do we need to do so the environment is absolutely flourishing and thriving in the Gulf, as is the economy? Where's the beautiful question? I haven't heard it. All I hear is it the government's fault due to regulation? Was it BP's fault? Is it et cetera? Einstein was probably right. We can't solve these kind of problems at the level of consciousness that cause them. And I think part of the reason that we're seeing a yearning, and the yearning now translated into companies and governments beginning to experiment with artistic approaches, is because, it isn't so much because they believe they'll work, but they're getting desperate in their belief that they know the other stuff won't work. So how do we look at it differently? Let me put in Kubler-Ross's 5th stage. Her 5th stage is acceptance. And I have huge problems with their fifth stage. I understand it at an individual level, that you accept that the reality is that your days are numbered. But I think the acceptance isn't, at least for me, I can't go there, that we're doomed. This is it, guys, the environment, the whatever, the poverty, the wars, it's going to get us, so just accept it. I think that the acceptance is that we accept responsibility for doing something about it, and not an egotistical responsibility, but one hugely grounded in humility. That if we take everything we can collectively, maybe we'll get there, but we better start this afternoon because we actually have run the clock fairly close to the end. How would our conversation at the Academy meetings look if we looked at the planet's and society's viability as our responsibility? If you're really honest with yourself, there actually isn't a brighter, smarter, more committed group of people someplace else in the world who's going to solve it for us. If we don't make a difference, if we don't change this, who's going to do it? Let me give you a couple images of some of the who's doing it and how they're drawing on the artistic world to make it happen. Experiment. Yale University, 20 years ago, tried a little experiment. They actually tried it in their medical school. And their medical school, which is a very good medical school, was teaching their medical students diagnostic skills. That's good, because that's something physicians need to have. But the experiment they decided to try was that the medical school partnered with the art history department and decided to take a group. This was designed as a good experiment. They had the control group who got the normal diagnostic stuff that they teach, the normal readings, all the rest of that, and the experimental group was sent off to a British art history course. This isn't a drawing class. This isn't a go do it. This is like go look at how to look at paintings course. They were completely shocked when by the end of a semester, the medical students who had been taking the art history course were significantly better at diagnosing the symptoms and figuring out what it was that was going on with people than were their normally trained people. And initially they couldn't figure it out. Once they started looking at what was going on, of course, one of the things looking at art does is it teaches you to look at the whole pattern of what's going on. It teaches you to look at, well, maybe it's the texture and maybe it's the color and maybe it's the dynamic interplay and maybe if I guess this thing, it might be a totally different interpretation. It actually, when they then watched the medical students, they found that they took in more data than did their colleagues who were not trained with art. They withheld judgment longer on what that constellation meant, and they were less sure, in a good sense, of their diagnosis, so that if they had a diagnosis of it was disease A, and the person didn't start responding to the treatment in a way they had hoped or liked, they more quickly went back and said, well, maybe it's B, instead of kind of hammering them with more of whatever the way they were supposed to treat them in the first place. Today, 20 other of the major medical schools in North America have copied Yale's program. There's a wonderful Dutch artist, Frederick Frank, who actually worked with Albert Schweitzer, who wants to teach everybody in the world how to draw. And the reason he wants to do it is not because he actually believes that all of us are latent, brilliant artists and we could be showing in museums, but what's the core skill of drawing? Seeing, absolutely. One of the classic things they teach you when you're first learning to draw is they'll like put something upside down or cover it up so you don't know what it is, and you draw it absolutely perfectly. And then when you put like a person in front of you, you do this miserable version of their face with their eyes too high and too far apart and all the rest of that, because we all have a conception in our head of what a face is supposed to look like, and that completely blinds us from seeing what's there. Why would we even bother with trying these experiments if we didn't think what we were doing mattered? We all know we can get applause from our clients. We don't need to change for that reason. We need to change so that it'll work. Do we have the courage to see reality the way it is? I think artists are brilliant at being able to bring back a way of seeing. Second question, and the area that artists and great leaders have in common, is around the question, do we have the skills and the courage to see possibility? There's a huge paradigm shift going on right now in management schools between looking at management as we have been, which is wrapped around decision-making, problem-solving and decision-making, over to a design perspective. The classic MBA training gives you better and better analytic skills to decide among various options. What does design bring to that that's any different? Design perspective says, can we create an option worthy of choosing? The question isn't anymore which of the prior ways of doing things should we do in this circumstance, decision-making model. The question is, can we design a system worthy of choosing? There are actually quite a number of companies that are now circling art schools, not so that they can have artists in residence, but so that they can have design skills inside of their companies. Roger Martin brought Bruce Ma, who's one of the absolutely top Canadian designers known around the world, into helping to design the whole curriculum. There's now a whole positive organizational design conference that's doing a brilliant job of integrating design into management education. And for those of you who haven't read Richard Boland and Fred Colopy's book on design thinking and managing as designing, it's brilliant. It's delightful and it's brilliant. Let me give you a couple. What would designing options look like? Again, some of my favorites are Bobby Sager. Bobby Sager is an American venture capitalist, made a ton of money, set up a foundation, started giving out money. Nothing new or different about that. Very quickly, Bobby Sager decides that that isn't what he could most give to the world. What he can most give to the world is his skills around business. So he actually set up in YPO, Young Presidents Organization, he set up their peace network. If you ran GDP statistics on YPO as if it was a country, it would be the third richest country in the world. It's leaders of business that get invited into it. So he took that kind of network and skills and perspective, and where does he go? He goes off to Rwanda after the genocide. Then he set up a program that you and I would label as microenterprise, but it had a nice little wiggle in it. And that's that, similar to other microenterprises, it was hugely skewed towards women who are starting new businesses and helping them get going and which ones would work and everything. But every business had to have one member who was a Hutu woman whose father, son, brother, etc., had been convicted or accused of having murdered a Tutsi, and a Tutsi woman whose father, son, brother, cousin had been murdered. So what did he do? He took an economic structure, little micro joint enterprises, and turned it into a social stability structure. That project is run completely by Rwandan women, and he still supports it in back of it. And oh, by the way, before you write off this story as a basket case, you are all aware that Rwanda, up until this last economic blip in the world, was growing at 11% a year. The news picks up the genocide, but it doesn't pick up. That isn't all because of Bobby Sager's project, but it's doing something right. His next project, he went off to the Middle East. You know, if Rwanda is your warm-up act, what do you try next? And he, like all of us, knows that war and the threat of war and political instability isn't real good for the economy. So he goes first to Tel Aviv, and he meets with the YPO chapter there. Tel Aviv has had a YPO chapter for lots of years, 40 years or something like that. Meets with primarily very well-placed businessmen, sprinkling of women. We won't talk about that topic right now. Okay. He then goes over to Ramallah, and he actually helped them found a YPO chapter. About 9 months later, he suggests to both groups that they get together. So here you've got the most prominent business leaders on both sides, most of whom had never met any of the people on the other side. He convinces both sides to do it. There was then a whole thing about where they would meet. And the ultimate decision was they met in Tel Aviv, where? At a Sting concert. Sting is a friend of Bobby Sager, so that part worked out. But why did he choose that? Because he completely, yes, he got them together, and YPO, social technology, as people get together for dinner, they talk to each other, they find out about their situation. They did all of that, but he believed that unless they embodied the new relationship, it wouldn't work. Translation, unless they danced together, it wouldn't work. It would never hold with just words. And that network has been going on for now over 2 years. One of the people who wanted to come was Mohammed Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority's son. He's a prominent businessman. Of course, politically, he couldn't come. So he disguised himself, got snuck across the border, and was there. One of my other favorite ones is BHP Billiton, which is a huge mining company, right? Went off into Mozambique, starts its whole mining thing, runs into malaria, which was, I mentioned earlier, still rampant in Africa. There's this belief that you can solve malaria every place else in the world, but not in Africa. And within a year, they were in complete the company was in trouble because they had more than a fifth of their employees out at any one time with malaria. They tried their little, giving out mosquito nets and stuff to their employees. The mosquitoes, of course, didn't bother to look if people were wearing their name tag and saying they were employee, slept under it, so they kept biting them. They kept getting malaria. They then said, okay, we'll do a whole community around there. That didn't work because mosquitoes don't need passports, so they still came into the community. And then they finally got serious, and they partnered with the three governments. So with the Mozambique, South African, and Swaziland government, they had a huge catchment area, and guess what? They drove the rate of malaria into the ground. Therefore, the kids weren't sick, so the rate of kids, elementary school kids attending school went from 30% up to over 90%. The number of people in the hospitals went down, so the hospitals with their scant resources could focus on something other than malaria. And the really fun one was they blew up the myth that you can't solve malaria in Africa. Because it's really hard when somebody's doing it right to say that it's impossible. Private sector partnering with the public sector, using a whole set of ways of being that they had never done before. Last of the three. First one being, can we see reality the way it is? Can we imagine possibilities, which means designing, not decision-making our way into possibilities? And the third one is, do we have the courage to inspire people to move from current reality back to possibility? Do we have the courage and skills to defy Kubler-Ross's stages, to not get into denial, to not get into trapped in depression, to not get trapped into acceptance. What can we do? We're only Canada. We're a small country. Well, hey, Canada is great at middle country initiatives. They just get a bunch of friends around the world and they start doing stuff anyway. So what is it from your unique position, wherever you stand in the world, that will allow you to design something that will make a difference? To deal with, can we inspire people to go from reality back to possibility, we have to nail into one of the domains within the academy that I humbly have to admit is part of my home discipline. That's organization behavior, goes over into HR, but is motivation. There are hundreds of motivation studies. I'm at the point of wanting to throw all of them out, because the underlying premise on motivation studies is, can I get you to do something that you probably wouldn't do otherwise and manipulate you? Our most blatant manipulation is with salary and raises. Oh, by the way, you know the little system they do for professors? If you publish in an A-listed journal, you will get 10,000 or 20. There actually, I don't know if there's more than 20,000 out there, but there are rewards at the 20,000 level for, okay, you get more citations, you get money, right? Our motivation schemes. Can we go back to human beings actually want to do the right thing? How do we inspire them to do it? I'm going to give two last images on that. One, hey, I've got the microphone, so why not? A lot of you know that I did a whole bunch of studies on women as global leaders, women who are presidents or prime ministers of countries, women who are CEOs of companies. I want to do a quick little test in here. If we're looking at moving from motivation to inspiration, actually having the courage to think that the beautiful is possible, we can get there. If I ask you, how many women do you think have been president or prime minister of their country, any country in the world, including this one, in the last 50 years, last half century? How many would you say? You know, just think about it for a minute. 25. 30, 25, 10. We're in a deflationary spiral at the moment.
The numbers are coming down.
7. Okay, you guys, the number is 89. The number is 89. So the first piece of this, as we try and pull into this last one, remember the very first question, do we see reality the way it is? Okay, guess what? There's optimism hiding out there. It's just not hiding inside of our myth structure. And oh, by the way, in case any of you are getting worried about my next sentence after that, there's some horrendous ones. There's some good ones, and there's some horrendous ones. So it's exactly like men. What we need in the world is the best of both of them. We do not need just men, and we do not need just women, but that's another talk, so we won't go there. When I looked at what was the reaction in countries around the world that chose their first woman leader, two things jumped out. One is, in the run-up to the election, the choice of that woman leader, in almost every place, there was an extremely high yearning for something different. There was an extremely high awareness that what we're doing right now isn't working. And then the way the rest of that myth structure goes is, you guys, men, have gotten us into this mess. Let's try something different. The other one was even more intriguing. Once you have the first woman chosen, then there's an overwhelming sense that other firsts are possible. So if we elected our first woman, then maybe we can in fact have peace between whichever of the arguing groups in that society. Maybe in fact we can get the economy going. Maybe in fact, you can't get there logically. You can't go, I voted for a woman that, or for the economy's going to work. You can't get there that way. But the belief structure is, if we could break that pattern that nobody thought we could break and bring in this person who's new, we can do other things that are new. And it begins to move it out of where it was trapped and over into the inspirational structure that says, yes, we can. I want to come back very specifically to the financial mess. What happened with compensation packages in the financial mess? And there was this whole discussion, of course, about motivation and how you motivate a CEO who's the head of a large financial institution. And we were all told, and by the way, continue to be told, that you just can't get these really good guys who have the skills unless you pay them lots and lots and lots of money. And then there are little conversations off to the side about, is that greed or is that necessary? And then when they cap the salaries, it shows up in bonuses. So I'm being broad about, we need to pay them a lot of money. So Peter Drucker, years ago already, said, unless people are willing to work for you for nothing, you aren't really a leader. Unless you can inspire them by what you're making, how you're doing it, you're not really a leader. So if we ask, as we try to understand the financial situation, don't we have to ask ourselves, how many of those leaders in the financial service industry would show up on Monday morning if we gave them the opportunity of not getting paid in any form for this week, for this month, or this year? How many are hooked in some other way than out of a straight motivation structure? Which brings me to my last example, which is directly pointed at our profession, education. As you know, in a number of countries, the U.S. is quite prominent in this one, there's an education crisis. That the level of literacy, numeracy is actually going down, and it certainly isn't at the level that will give people the kind of skills they need in the 21st century. So we now have two competing models. The first one has been suggested by Roland Fryer, who is a Harvard economics professor. And what he suggests that we do, what he's recommended that we do, and a lot of people are agreeing with him, is that we pay students for getting A's. A little bit less, A minus, a little bit less, B plus, a little bit less, but we pay them for grades. Kind of like a lot of universities are doing with professors right now. Get an A listed, $20,000. Get an A minus, $10,000. They figured out that's supposed to work with us. Okay? Alternative program. There's a woman here in Canada, Nora Savage, and she came up with an alternative educational motivation scheme. Nora works basically on storytelling skills, an art form. Nora went into high schools, 12th graders, those kids who are about ready to graduate, the kids who absolutely could care less because they're about ready to graduate, and you're irrelevant and they're about ready to graduate. Those are the ones she went into, and she was supposed to be teaching them, grammar and structure of stories and vocabulary. Her design was that she chose to pair each of them with a stage 1 Alzheimer patient. And the job of the high school senior was to go interview their elder and find out their story. Now, they were coached on how Alzheimer's works, so you started with the early stories, so you had greater memory. The kids were grouchy. What do you mean we have to meet with them every week, all semester long? All they had to do is have the first meeting. And guess what? Kids aren't stupid, no matter how much I think sometimes our education system encourages the behavior. As soon as they started interviewing and they watched this human being light up because somebody was actually listening to them as a human being rather than a constellation of Alzheimer's symptoms, the person was alive. And they were responsible for that person coming alive. They begged and pleaded to show up 2 times a week, 3 times a week. They begged and pleaded for, how do you really write up a story? How do you really interview her? What did you say those listening skills were? How do you choose to divide into chapters? And then the outcome of this is each of them made a presentation, like an assembly, where the elder was able to invite family, friends, whoever they wanted, and the student presented their stories. Well, none of the teachers had ever seen as much work go into it. Of course, the assemblies were great. And oh, by the way, the families loved it because they had their member of the family back, because all of a sudden they weren't concentrating on the disease. They heard stories they didn't hear, and it didn't cost the welfare system or the medical system anything. Let me close with a piece of Montreal. As you know, I teach at McGill, and I teach a course called Global Leadership Redefining Success, which is for the new incoming MBAs. I get them for the first 3 days that they're in the program, 9 to 5, before they meet any of my colleagues. We do all sorts of things. We do art things, whatever, but the leitmotif is mantra. Given who you are, you're privileged, you're educated, you now have 2 years to learn whatever you want. What is it that you want to do with these skills, and therefore what skills do you need? The single most frequent comment that comes at the end of the 3 days is, but I didn't know that other MBAs would care about the kind of things that I care about. And then the end of that sentence might be the environment, might be balance between a home life and professional life, might be people in other parts of the world. Even in the little time of having chosen to apply to an MBA program and get in, had already accepted the mythology of an MBA, which is individualistic and greedy, and I'm going to get ahead. Okay? And so they were shocked that that wasn't it. Embarrassingly, I was shocked that that was the most frequent comment. But we're all trained to see patterns and to learn quickly. So I now understand that my most important role in working, whether with the MBAs or managers, is to out their humanity. Because once it's out of the box, they put their skills together with their humanity. And I think our fundamental role as artists, and I refer to everybody as an artist, whether we label personally ourselves as an artist or not, as we approach how we design what should be and could be happening in the world, is to out our own humanity, that of the people we have the privilege to work with, and by doing that, to reinvent our global legacy and not let Kubler-Ross define at a macro level what the end of our story will be.